Finally, at last, our annual blockbuster video is here. Without further ado, here's the 2025 Global Economic Overview. In 2025, Trump's tariff whirlwind swept through almost every corner of the globe, effectively reshaping the global economic landscape that had been built over the previous half-century. With so many chaotic headlines, what kind of new trade pattern has actually emerged? What kinds of difficulties are the economies of the United States and China facing internally? How has economic turmoil given rise to political instability in Germany and Japan? And who is truly the strongest engine driving the global economy? Today, since so much has happened this year, I plan to break our discussion into several parts. First, a global overview. Then, in Chapter 1, I want to give a comprehensive look at this year's tariff negotiations. What exactly did the US achieve in its talks with various countries? Chapter 2 will focus on the major economies, the US, China, Japan, and Europe. We'll go through them one by one, and also make some cross-comparisons to see which country had the best economic performance this year, which did the worst, and which had the highest inflation, while also taking a look at the situations in other countries. Finally, we'll look ahead to 2026. Can you already sense how much we have to talk about today? You could say there's an incredible amount to cover. In order to touch on every aspect without making it too lengthy, let me tell you, I started out with a 40,000-word script and managed to cut it down to under 20,000 words. I've done my part. Don't you think it's your turn now? So, what was the main theme of the global economy this whole year? I summed it up in a little rhyming verse. The US makes its moves, other countries follow, inflation wraps up, governments embrace the AI boom, and the new employment landscape is quite fragmented, isn't it? Alright, let's take another look, shall we? You see, when Trump barged in, he stirred up the waters of the global economy, so now everyone is busy trying to find new directions and new partners in this muddy situation. According to IMF estimates, the global GDP growth rate for the whole year is 3.2%. You might not have a clear sense of what that means, but just looking at this number, it's rather bland and normal, but in the context of the current global trade restructuring, it's actually quite a good result. Why is that? On one hand, you can see that governments around the world are actively negotiating and maneuvering to reduce and delay tariffs. At the same time, companies in various countries that have been affected are trying to minimize economic losses by stockpiling goods in advance and engaging in re-export trade. They might even absorb some of the profit losses themselves to cope with this temporary upheaval. So, for end consumers in different countries, the impact might not feel very strong yet. This is the US making moves and other countries responding. At least looking ahead to 2025, most countries have managed to handle it. When it comes to wrapping up inflation, what governments are really talking about is the monetary and fiscal policies of various countries. In terms of inflation, except for Japan, most countries have already seen inflation recede and central bank interest rates are slowly coming down. At the same time, all major economies are facing limited economic growth and a rise in protectionism, which has led everyone, despite different paths, to the same outcome: expanding deficits, increasing borrowing, and spending more themselves. In this regard, there are almost no exceptions. Overall, the era of hard money has come to an end, and what is about to begin is the era of global government borrowing. The next thing that must be mentioned for 2025 is the sudden rise of AI-related technology industries with exceptionally active capital expenditures. This has become one of the rare bright spots in the global economy. Hey, don't think that AI is just a short-term hype or a media-created trend. No, no, no. When we analyze the US economy in a moment, you'll gain a much deeper understanding. This time, although AI has driven an explosion in capital expenditure, it actually hasn't provided significant support to the job market. In fact, you could even say that AI has poured cold water on the global employment market. This is not just alarmist talk. It's objectively happening, especially in the United States. If you look at AI-related industries, capital is being poured in relentlessly, but the number of jobs is not increasing. In fact, it's decreasing. Now, the global trade network has formed a new pattern. In the past, everyone pursued manufacturing wherever it was cheapest, but now it has shifted to manufacturing wherever it is safest. The model is moving away from the rule-based, WTO-led approach to one that is more transactional and more politicized. This new pattern has resulted in fragmentation. There is fragmentation between countries, between consumers and producers, between industries, and between the rich and the poor. First, let's begin with Chapter 1, the global tariff war. I'll help everyone sort out the entire logic behind global tariff negotiations. First of all, why did Trump initiate the tariff war? This time, it's referred to as Trump's Trade War 2.0. Compared to the previous 1.0 version, the most fundamental difference is that it has shifted from targeting China to indiscriminate attacks, universal tariffs. You see, Trump-style tariffs, right? It's a play on words. Trump said that America has long been exploited and plundered by cheaters. What he means is that Americans have always been taken advantage of, and he needs to correct this situation for them. As for the specific reasons, he mentioned several points: reversing the trade deficit, increasing government revenue, bringing manufacturing back to the US, and protecting key industries for national security. Then there's bargaining with other countries. Of these reasons, which tariffs are effective and which are not. We've analyzed this in detail before. To summarize briefly, the first two are actually not very effective. The trade deficit is actually driven by continuous dollar outflows and financial account deficits. Tariffs simply serve to restructure trade relationships with a limited overall effect. Regarding revenue, the situation is even more obvious. With 4.1 trillion in imports, tariffs would likely only bring in 300 billion more, just 6% of government revenue, while offending the world. Purely for revenue, tariffs are definitely very limited. Thus, for these two reasons, it's just symbolic rhetoric from Trump. The think tanks definitely know that these 2 points are a bit far-fetched, but the next 3 reasons for tariffs are indeed useful, especially the last one, bargaining. Over the past year, Trump really hasn't taken a break. You could say he's negotiated with almost every country and region one by one. So you see, the core of his tariff war is actually not about economics, but about politics and industrial strategy. Right, so how did the United States start this tariff war? Basically, it launched attacks on 3 fronts at the same time. The first was targeting the North American Free Trade Agreement, mainly threatening Canada and Mexico. As early as February and March, the US began threatening them with a 25% tariff, and even tied in issues like border drug problems during negotiations. The second front was the protection of specific industries, with the main focus on raising tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles. In the end, tariffs on steel and aluminum were raised to 50%, and automobiles to 25%. Then, the largest and most aggressive move was the so-called Liberation Day tariffs on April 2nd. Trump signed Executive Order 14257, imposing a 10% baseline tariff on nearly all imports starting April 5th. A list of reciprocal tariffs for various regions was also announced for April 9th. As noted, the logic behind these reciprocal tariffs is questionable, so what are the specific rates? Mainland China 34%, the European Union 20%, Japan 24%, India 26%, Vietnam 46%, and so on and so forth. Trump called this day Liberation Day. Therefore, these tariff policies are all referred to as Liberation Day tariffs. Liberation Day. This Liberation Day spooked the market like a beast unleashed. Before the trade war, US tariffs were just 2 to 3%, essentially negligible. When Trump hiked rates to 20, 30, or even 40%, people questioned his sanity. Stocks and bonds plummeted as panicked investors fled to gold and the yen, forcing the US government to act. They quickly came out and said, "Oh, sorry, the reciprocal tariffs will be suspended for 90 days. I'll give you some time to think it over, so hurry up and come negotiate with me." I guess when Trump announced these reciprocal tariffs, he definitely expected that other countries would react strongly, but what he didn't anticipate was that the market would react just as intensely. A drop in the stock market might be tolerable, but this was something else. Why did US treasuries fall so much? Tariffs aside, a treasury crash is a major crisis. Ultimately, capital markets still control Trump. Alright, so how did different countries respond? Let's look at China first. China's reaction was the strongest and toughest among all countries. At the beginning, there was a fierce counterattack, with both sides raising tariffs higher and higher, and verbally, the rates even exceeded 100%. Later, in May, at Geneva, both sides calmed down, and then there were prolonged negotiations until the Busan Repentance in October, which resulted in a phased trade agreement. Simply put, both sides made concessions on tariffs to resolve the conflict. This temporarily eased tensions. The US halted 24% reciprocal tariffs, halved fentanyl tariffs to 10%, and paused entity list restrictions. China also lowered tariffs, lifted rare earth export curbs, promised to buy American soybeans, and vowed to curb fentanyl-related flows into the US. Everyone knows this was just a tactical truce between both sides. It was definitely not a long-term or sustainable trade agreement. Both sides would continue to pull and negotiate. And if you look at this agreement, it's not as if the US only imposed this basic 10% tariff on China. The tariffs between the US and China are extremely complicated, with Section 301 tariffs, Section 232, 201, and so on. In short, there are punitive tariffs on different sectors and different products. So, what is the actual average tariff rate overall? If you look at the period before 2018, the average US tariff on China was less than 5%. That was before Trade War 1.0. It rose to about 22%, then at its peak every 5 years reached 57%, and later fell back to 47%. According to estimates, the effective tariffs collected were around 32%. As for China's tariffs on the US, they also increased from about 20% in 2014 to around 32%. Keep in mind, this is just an average estimate, not the final precise figure. Now, let's take a look at the European Union. As for the EU, trade with the US once had almost no tariffs. Then, Trump's proposed 20% tariff met a tough EU stance, threatening retaliatory tariffs on 95 billion euros of US goods. Negotiations eventually led to a basic agreement. That is, a 15% basic tariff, with steel at 50% non-negotiable. But note, cars are at 15%, below the US 25% rate. The EU also promised to buy $750 billion in US energy within 3 years and invest $600 billion. Meanwhile, the US would impose zero tariffs on EU cars. These are significant concessions. The EU lacks unity when negotiating tariffs. Take Germany, for example. With many car exports to the US, Germany primarily fears auto tariffs. The US originally set a 25% rate, which is their main concern. Their stance is, if you avoid such high car tariffs, everything else is negotiable. Meanwhile, France doesn't care about cars at all. France prioritizes agricultural products and the digital tax. They insist on not making concessions quickly or sacrificing European interests just for German cars. Meanwhile, Eastern Europe feels security is paramount, and we shouldn't upset the Americans. For them, tariffs are negotiable. Let's negotiate. What do the big countries think? And then, as for the other countries, they all have their own positions, but in the end, it mainly comes down to a contest between Germany and France. So after this 15% result came out, the French were clearly unhappy. The French Prime Minister said that very day that this agreement was a dark day for the EU, whereas the reaction from Germany was quite different. Merz said, "We have successfully avoided an unnecessary escalation in transatlantic trade relations. We can't expect more than this." As for the markets, they were actually quite straightforward. As soon as the negotiation results were announced, European stocks rose across the board, even reaching record highs. The implication being, well, even though you were bullied, I originally thought you would be bullied even worse. You've already done a great job. Thumbs up to you. Let me add a little bit here. So, the US imposes a 15% tariff on large European cars, but they already have a lot of previously negotiated trade agreements. So when you actually calculate it, the effective tariff is currently less than 10%. The UK, as America's close buddy, agreed the quickest and most readily, and quickly reached an agreement to enjoy a 10% tariff. You see, even a 10% tariff can be called a benefit now. At the same time, up to 100,000 cars are also allowed under this quota to enjoy the 10% tariff instead of 25%. Steel and aluminum also receive preferential treatment. It really is quite a benefit. In fact, this is also a key reason why Trump imposed tariffs on everyone at the same time. In theory, if you negotiate with each country one by one, it should be a bit easier. But if I target everyone at once, then you won't feel like I'm singling you out. You see, even though the UK was hit with a lot of tariffs, other countries had it much worse. So he's still chuckling to himself, still enjoying it. Australia is in a similar situation. Originally, when they exported a lot of aluminum and iron ore to the US, they faced very high protective tariffs. But after a round of protests, those tariffs on minerals were also reduced to around 10%. So they basically accepted it quite happily as well. Let's look at Japan and South Korea. At first, Japan was at 24 and South Korea at 25. Their response strategies were also quite similar, investing in exchange for tariff reductions. You see, the United States is a major customer for both Japan and South Korea's exports. Their main markets for cars and electronic products are in the US. So both countries gave in rather quickly, conceding without even verbally pushing back. At that point, Japan stated that it would invest $550 billion in the US, investing in your manufacturing, aerospace, energy, and so on. They also promised to increase imports of your agricultural products and to speed up the process for American cars to enter the Japanese market. South Korea made similar promises, pledging to invest $350 billion. At the same time, major Japanese and Korean companies like Toyota, Hyundai, and Samsung are all accelerating the pace of building factories in the US by 2025. And in return, to what level did the US lower their tariffs? In the end, it was also reduced to 15%, including for automobiles. Next is the tariff negotiation between India and the US, aside from China. India is actually one of the tougher ones. Initially, its reciprocal tariff was 26%, and it didn't make many concessions, nor was it willing to ease market access restrictions or open up its agricultural market. The tariff was directly reduced from 26% to 25%. But afterwards, because India had previously purchased energy from Russia, Trump decided to impose secondary sanctions on them, adding an extra 25% punitive tariff. So India's tariff became 50%. Right now, both sides are still negotiating and pulling back and forth. The general consensus in the market is that a 50% tariff is unlikely to be a long-term measure, and India is quite likely to make some concessions. Overall, India's stance remains rather tough, and the reason for this is actually easy to understand. India's market doesn't really need the United States that much. It has always been a relatively closed market, and in recent years, it has developed rapidly, so it can withstand this kind of short-term shock. That's why it can afford to stand firm. All in all, the tariff structure between the US and various countries has basically been settled. So what does this look like? For close allies or countries with a trade surplus with the US, the tariff is set at 10%, the typical examples being the UK and Australia. Then, for so-called friends, meaning those who make concessions in trade negotiations, the rate is about 15% to 20%, such as the EU, Japan, and South Korea. For countries the US wants to put pressure on, or those with a particularly severe trade deficit, the rate starts at 25%, and any punitive tariffs will be added on top of that. As for America's neighbors, Canada and Mexico, well, this is a bit special. Although Trump once made serious threats, at present, over 80% of goods still comply with the USMCA agreement, and the actual overall average tariff is estimated to be less than 5%. According to JP Morgan's estimates, the overall average tariff in the US is 17%, and as negotiations progress, it may drop even further. You see, Trump's overall negotiation logic is actually about using tariffs to bargain with other countries. He doesn't have a clear overarching goal. He's extremely flexible. If you want to impose tariffs on me or protect your own interests, then you have to make concessions. For wealthy countries like the EU, Japan, South Korea, and Switzerland, he wants them to invest. For countries where he has political needs like Brazil and Canada, he negotiates politically. For those who depend on the US, he asks for more. For those who are less dependent, he asks for less, using this approach to rebalance the situation. Short term, regarding US relations with all countries except China and India, most others accuse the US of unilateralism, but concede privately. Let's examine the costs and benefits for the US after these negotiations. On the benefit side, it is estimated that in the end, the US government will gain an additional $300 billion in tariff revenue annually, while also attracting at least $1.5 trillion in committed investments. There may also be some private agreements that haven't been publicly reported, and certain sectors of American manufacturing and traditional industries have been protected. As for the costs, the most direct one is that this could very likely bring inflation problems to the US. More crucially, there are longer-term, deeper, and perhaps invisible costs, such as the severe depletion of trust that the US has built up over half a century. You can see this reflected in the decline of the US dollar. This is a very clear market signal. But honestly, this might actually solve the US trade deficit problem, haha. At the same time, although other countries are forced to make concessions in the short term, once they recover, they are very likely to establish new bilateral cooperation and new alliances. Some people might ask, isn't there the WTO? Why doesn't the World Trade Organization step in? Well, it does want to intervene. But generally, the US has two tactics to deal with this. The first is national security, this all-purpose card. If they run into a particularly stubborn WTO expert panel, if you accuse the US of abusing the national security excuse, the US has a second move. It can file an appeal, which then enters the WTO's appeals process. However, since 2019, the US has refused to approve any new appointments of WTO judges. What does this lead to? Now, there is not a single judge left in the appeals body, so these disputes can be postponed indefinitely. The WTO has basically entered a state of brain death. All it can do now is issue condemnations, appeals, and warnings. In short, it has been completely sidelined. Alright, next we move on to Chapter 2, the overall performance of major economies in 2025, starting with the United States. To sum up the US economy for the entire year in one word, okay. What does okay mean? It means that the real economy's performance wasn't particularly impressive, but there weren't any major issues either. Even with the tariff war in full swing and such huge fluctuations in the capital markets, the US and the global economy, well, they're still okay. The IMF estimates that the US GDP growth rate in 2025 will be 2%, with an inflation rate of 2.7% and an unemployment rate of 4.2%. For those who don't often look at economic data, these numbers might not mean much, but simply put, within the context of the US economy, they're just boring. Not high, not low, nothing special. But in reality, this nothing special is actually a very good result for the US at the moment. If you look at our economic summaries from the past 2 years, the US economy was facing significant risks. Not just tariffs, but also inflation and unemployment. Commercial real estate, especially with the Federal Reserve keeping interest rates so high, hasn't had any major problems, which is already quite impressive. Morgan Stanley says the US economy is achieving a soft landing. That's the overview. Next, let's talk specifically about some key points regarding the US economy in 2025. First is the decline of the US dollar. Although tariffs are a hot topic, their short-term impact on the economy is limited. What has a more obvious effect? It's the impact on the US dollar and US Treasury bonds in the capital markets. We actually made a dedicated video discussing this before. In the first half of 2025, the US dollar experienced its worst opening in half a century, but by the second half of the year, it had basically stabilized. There was a period in between when both US Treasury bonds and the dollar were falling. Normally, these two should be negatively correlated. The breakdown of this correlation is mainly due to a decline in market confidence in the US dollar. UBS believes that in the upcoming year, 2026, if employment data is weak or if the next Federal Reserve chair is extremely dovish, it could trigger a new round of dollar sell-offs. Next is the expansion of US government debt. In 2025, the US government is expected to collect $5.2 trillion in revenue and spend $7 trillion, resulting in a deficit of $1.8 trillion. Currently, US government debt has exceeded $38 trillion, which is about 120% of GDP. Starting from May 1st, the US government shut down again, marking the 11th time in history, and this shutdown lasted for a record 43 days, the longest ever. Actually, the US government's excessive spending has been a very long-standing issue. Government shutdowns have become so common that people are no longer surprised by them. It's one of those important but not urgent problems. We actually mentioned this issue during our review last year, but in 2025 this problem suddenly becomes much more urgent. On one hand, the market has started to lose confidence in the US government, leading to a sell-off of US Treasury bonds, which in turn raises the government's borrowing costs. Another very crucial factor is the passage of the so-called Big and Unstoppable Act, and the significance of this act for the US economy. I see its impact as far greater than tariffs. It essentially redefines the US budget like a massive spending bill. The specifics are complex, covering over 1,000 pages of tax cuts, subsidy reductions, and defense hikes. In short, it signals even more stimulus spending, pushing debt levels higher. It is expected to add at least $3 trillion to the national debt. In fact, the passage of this bill was highly controversial. In the Senate, there were 51 votes in favor and 50 against, with all Democrats opposing it. But regardless, passed is passed. Now, what is the underlying consensus that both parties have actually reached? To support the short-term development of the US economy, the government has to spend money. To support government spending, it needs to support government bonds. And who supports government bonds? That's right, it's the Federal Reserve. The Fed either needs to cut interest rates or directly print money to buy government bonds, quantitative easing, to support the government's debt and keep this system running. For the government, what is a rather tricky problem? It's that the Federal Reserve doesn't really listen. After all, the Fed's goal is to maintain price and employment stability, and it has no obligation to help the government maintain interest rates. That's why there was a major drama in 2025, the war of words between Trump and Fed Chair Powell. Trump used all kinds of language to provoke Powell, calling him Mr. Too Late, and even threatening to fire him, all in hopes that the Fed would cut rates sooner and by a larger margin. Later, seeing that Powell was hard to deal with, Trump turned to other members of the Fed's Board of Governors, even placing his own confidant Milan onto the board. We've discussed this series of moves in detail before. Why wasn't Powell in a hurry to cut interest rates? We won't go into a detailed analysis today, there really isn't enough time. The main reasons are that he's concerned about the impact of tariffs on prices, and the unemployment rate is indeed rising rather quickly. That's why you'll notice that the Fed's rate cuts are always a step behind those of Canada and Europe. Another major theme of the US economy is AI. Sure, AI was hot in the past couple of years too, but after reading so many research reports, I've realized that AI in 2025 is truly different. The importance of AI to the US economy is no longer just about a single industry. It has reached a level where it can determine the direction of the entire US economy. Right now, the US economy is on a very narrow growth path, essentially going all in on AI. You'll often see a term in these reports, CAPEX, or capital expenditure. What is capital expenditure? It's mainly about data centers. The big US tech companies are pouring money like crazy into building those massive AI data centers, integrating hundreds of thousands or even millions of AI chips. Just in 2025 alone, the AI-related capital expenditure of these four companies will exceed an astonishing $300 billion, which is already 100% of the entire annual tariff revenue of the United States. I see, but when you walk, these companies are not only pouring in their own money, they're also aggressively attracting overseas capital. For example, in September, Oracle issued $18 billion in bonds in a single go, with the longest term reaching 40 years. This is the largest single investment-grade bond ever issued by a tech company in history. AI demand is massive. Otherwise, how could Nvidia become the world's most valuable company? How could Oracle's boss briefly top the rich list? These six giants have a combined value of nearly $20 trillion, making up nearly a third of the entire US market. Of course, not all of them are AI companies. For example, Apple's valuation related to AI isn't that high. But from another perspective, why has Apple's momentum slowed down so much recently? The main reason is that its progress in AI has fallen a bit behind. Right now, the US stock market is almost entirely focused on AI, especially on those leading AI companies. The US government is also cooperating by cutting taxes and loosening regulations for AI-related businesses, with Trump leading investment efforts and so on. This AI investment boom is not only supporting the US stock market and household wealth, but also masking the cyclical weakness in other parts of the US economy. You see, that's why I say the US economy has basically bet everything on AI. Alright, let's analyze this further. Will AI really be able to achieve such great things in the future, and are those valuations justified? It's hard to say for sure about the future, but at least from the perspective of finance and capital markets, there's a very crucial logical chain here. You see, the US economy is betting on AI, and these AI giants want to keep expanding steadily and continuously. A necessary condition for expanding investment is that their stock prices can't collapse. So part of the development of the US economy is essentially relying on the stock prices of these tech companies not crashing. Of course, this logical chain isn't absolute, but I think it's reasonable to a certain extent. In the past, people used to say that big banks couldn't be allowed to fail. Now, these AI and tech companies are even bigger and even more too big to fail. It's not that their stocks can't fall at all, but they can't crash. They can't drop so sharply that it affects related investments and capital expenditures. That's why the US government has a very strong incentive to find ways to support the stock market and these AI-related stocks. To be honest, in tech giant battles, retail investors risk becoming fodder, so don't rush in blindly. For the US government, treasury bonds must stay stable to keep interest rates low. The stock market must also hold to support AI investment. In fact, the entire capital market can't fall. So what can they do? Who can they rely on?